All right, students, we are back in part two of part three of our lecture series on Athens. Thank you for coming back. In this particular lecture, we'll just talk about the social groups that we see in ancient Athens who existed under their democracy. So, look how many farmers there were. The majority of Athenian citizens were farmers. And our book has many interesting kind of facts about what it was like farming, being a farmer in Athens. Athens itself is not a particularly hospitable environment for crops. So it has rocky soil, it has a climate that does not encourage growth. But somehow the Athenian farmers made it work, and they did so very creatively, using the land creatively. And so 90% of the population, now I am very bad at math, but so 90% of 100,000 people, it's kind of a lot. So that's where they got the majority of their products, right? Just a little bit of vocabulary. Most Greek people lived in what was called an oikos, or a household. So the word oikos means house, but oikos itself can refer to the entire household. This is, and I know that some of you know this already because I talk about it in other classes all the time. Oikos is where we get the word economy. The econ in economy is from oikos. So if you're an econ major, you're essentially a Greek major. So you might as well take ancient Greek. Come take it. And then the nomos part of that means law. So economics is the law of the house, oikos. So this was kind of the fundamental unit of the Greek world, of the Athenian world. Let me just emphasize that, of the Athenian world. Sparta, for instance, did not function on an oikos level. That just wasn't a thing for them. So every oikos probably had what was a kleros, a small plot of land that they would use to plant their crops, etc. This was sometimes very close to Athens, but it was sometimes kind of in the countryside, a little bit further from Athens, in kind of the suburbs, which were called Attica. Olive trees and grapevines were the primary crops. So grapevines, we know what they are. They're everywhere. This is a very famous olive tree on the Acropolis. It has been there an incredibly long time. It's been a minute since I looked it up, but I want to say it's been there for like thousands of years. So olive trees were incredibly important to the Greeks. I could give a whole lecture about olive trees in Athens. The word sycophant, well, no, that refers to figs, but there was strict laws about exporting olive trees, and in every kind of war campaign, and I know that I mentioned this, I think this might be the only time I get to talk about it. um, Cutting down olive trees was an incredibly violent and destructive act. And so when people attacked Athens, they would try to cut down the olive trees because, on average, it takes 7 years from planting to growth for an olive tree to produce fruit. So when you cut down their olive trees, you are essentially destroying their livelihood for many, many years. So it's a very interesting, I don't know. I think it's really fascinating. So, yes, but for when Athens was doing great, they had a ton of olive trees, and they were, making a living off of that. So, yes. So some other professions that we see in ancient Athens, mining was a big one. Silver mines in Athens were incredibly productive in the 5th century. It was a great source of wealth for them. Unfortunately, mining was also an incredibly dangerous job, just as now we see. I mean, my biggest experience with mining, to be honest with you, is that movie Zoolander. And I just think of Ben Stiller having the black lung. But it was very dangerous, very scary underground. And so often mining was done by slaves, but it was a job that people had. Trade in Athens was also a very productive and lucrative and big field. Athens is located on water. There's much sailing in and out. And so they did a lot of work there. And Athens, as we will see in the funeral oration, really encouraged people to come to Athens. They were very welcoming to people from all over the world. So that was great for their trading um, industry. And then manufacturing, so we have evidence, there's archaeological evidence of workshops in which shields were made, swords were made, knives were made, beds were made. So they were kind of, a manufacturing center. But what I really enjoyed this quote from our book about what it was like to manufacture things in ancient Athens. The Greeks had no tradition of applying their scientific understanding to creating more efficient ways of production. Even coins were made in an unsophisticated way, with each one stamped individually. Weaving was always done in the home. So, this quote is making reference to the fact that Athens was, as we will see, a hotbed of intellectual activity. Philosophy is there, teaching is there, math, science. Like, there was a lot of like high level thought happening, but no one ever thought about applying any sort of like standards or automation to the production of goods. So rather than having an assembly line in which a sword was made, it would be one guy creating sword from scratch. Instead of having an assembly line of coins, they were just done by one guy at a time. So I think that's a really interesting kind of critique of Athenian manufacturing. I'll also tell you, and I don't know if this would be interesting. I went to a talk last year, and right now in spring-ish of 2026, at the Getty Villa up in Malibu, they have a bunch of scholars there who will do like demonstrations as on coin making and other kinds of arts and how fine, like what a fine point it is, how difficult it is, how exacting it is. And it's kind of glorifying the attention to detail that this particular quote from our book is like, why did they just make it easier? So, anyhow, that's Athens professions. So, yes. Now here's as you can see, I put a big question mark with women. One of the most controversial questions that exercises scholars of the ancient world to this day is what life was like for a woman in ancient Athens. Because on the one hand, it seems like such a kind of progressive, open, exciting, welcoming city. But on the other, we have all of this evidence that women, especially women of richer families, were not allowed to leave the house. So on the one hand, you have scholars saying that the status of women in ancient Athens is comparable to the status of women in Afghanistan today, where they can't go outside, they can't go to school, they can't laugh in public, they always have to be covered up. So this is one end of the debate. The other end is like, maybe it wasn't so bad. It was not great. We absolutely know that women didn't have a lot of freedom of movement or communication, especially not if they were married to citizens. We also know that women were married incredibly young, probably around 12 or 13 years old. So they obviously had no choice in who they married. We don't have many women's voices coming out of ancient Athens. So we know it wasn't great. We just don't know how bad it was. We do have evidence that women could gather together. Women did have, as we will see in the religion section of this lecture, they were able to come together to practice, religious rituals. They did have moments. So, I mean, just like as a human, my kind of human experience suggests to me it wasn't quite as bad as the worst case makes it seem, but it definitely probably wasn't great. And the weird thing is there's kind of an interesting dichotomy because it was probably worst. It was probably the worst for women who were citizens. If you were an Athenian woman citizen, you had much more at stake in being exposed for bad behavior. Whereas if you were a medic, if you were a foreigner, so this is Aspasia, for instance, you probably had a lot more freedom of movement and speech because, not that much was expected of you. And of course, on top of all of this is the fact that the patron saint of the city is a female goddess. Sure, she's a virgin female goddess, but she's a female goddess. So it is a big mystery. I think this would be an amazing thing if you're at all interested in classics or history. I think there's still work to be done. There's still excavations out there. So, yeah, yeah. So that's the situation with women. Slaves, on the other hand, we do know quite a bit about. And this is another really interesting field, especially for anyone kind of tangentially interested in classical studies. Um, There was we know that Athens was built on slaves, built on the back of slaves. And just to reiterate, slavery in the ancient world was in no way based on the color of one's skin. Slaves were typically coming from conquered peoples. So Athens would go to war against another state somewhere. It would win. It would take all of the women and children back to Athens as slaves. We see this even in the story of the Trojan War. In the Trojan War, all of the royal Trojan women knew that when they were defeated, they would go to Greece as slaves. So that's what happened. It is, I think, understood that this may have changed since the last time I studied this, that if you were born to a slave woman, you were yourself a slave. There were possibilities of being freed. This absolutely happens, but you would never become a full citizen. Slaves, as and our book talks about how slaves functioned in the household. Almost every household, every oikos in Greek would have at least one slave. So slaves often worked in the field. If they were men, they would work in the field. If they were women, they would work in the house as maids or kind of wet nurses. The slaves worked in the silver mines. So, and they were really everywhere. And where I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done. When people first started translating Greek tragedies, Greek comedies, Greek philosophy, we translated a lot of professional names like maid, groom, you know, next door neighbor. Words that we know refer to slaves were kind of given euphemistic names. And I just realized this is such a niche point, but modern day scholars are still uncovering slave labor in ancient texts. I think it's a very interesting field. I'd be happy to talk to you about it if you're interested, but I will stop in case you're not. But one thing I really appreciated our book saying um, was about the difficulty just as living in the world as a slave. And the book says many had, in fact, come from barbarian cultures and so had gone through traumatic experiences even before either set, either set. I don't know what that's supposed to be. But so the slave had gone through a traumatic experience before they had started work for a Greek master. The slave's family had usually been broken up, and the psychological shock of becoming an owned person must have been severe. And I love that the book points this out, like just the trauma at the heart of this and the trauma that this city kind of profited from. I think it's always important to acknowledge. I'm glad to do it here. This little piece of art here. This is probably depicting two Athenian citizens just having dinner. And this is just another interesting fact about Athenian citizens. When they ate, they didn't sit down at a table. They always reclined on a couch, which I just think, wow, like they must have yeah, I mean, that just seems so messy to me. But anyhow, this is them living in their oikos. Look at their horse over here, super stoked. This is their slave. So whenever you see art in the ancient, depicting the ancient world, if you see some normal looking people and then a small figure, that would be a slave. So once you can see that, you see how much slaves are in art, but they always just look like children, right? So I wanted to give you that little key to understanding ancient art. So anyhow, I think that's it. I think that's the end of our slides on this one. Yes. So we're going to stop government/social groups here, and I'm going to stop this lecture. Come back to the next lecture where we will talk about religion and social spaces. I look forward to getting into it with you. Not like physically, just in terms of religion and social spaces. So I will see you then.